Hey there, folks. Clyde Chester here. And tonight, I want to tell you about the night Chicago did something so audacious, so absolutely crazy, that it changed the geography of an entire continent. I'm talking about January 2nd, 1900. The night Chicago's engineers literally reversed the flow of the Chicago River, and in doing so, pulled off one of the most ambitious acts of environmental engineering the world had ever seen. Now, I know what you're thinking. Clyde, how in the world do you make a river run backwards? Well, buckle up, because this story has everything. Desperation, death, backroom deals, and a city willing to bet its entire future on a ditch. Let me paint you a picture of Chicago in the 1890s. This was a city exploding at the seams. After the Great Fire of 1871, Chicago had rebuilt itself into an industrial powerhouse, the hog butcher for the world, the stacker of wheat, the player with railroads. Carl Sandburg would later write those words, and they weren't poetry, they were the plain truth. Nearly 2 million people crammed into a city that sat on a swamp, and all of them, every single one, needed to eat, drink, work, and, well, use the facilities. And that's where our story really begins, in the most unglamorous way possible, with sewage. You see, Chicago had a fundamental problem. The city sat right on the edge of Lake Michigan, one of the Great Lakes, which provided all the drinking water for those 2 million souls. But here's the catch. The Chicago River also flowed into Lake Michigan, and that river had become an open sewer. Every factory, every slaughterhouse, every tenement building dumped its waste straight into the river. Imagine it, blood from the stockyards, chemical runoff from tanneries, human waste from 1 million privies, all of it flowing into the same lake people were drinking from. The river itself was so thick with filth that witnesses said you could practically walk across it. One reporter described the river as having the consistency of thick soup, and he wasn't exaggerating for effect. The city tried everything they could think of. They built intake pipes that extended further and further into the lake, hoping to find clean water. But it didn't matter. The pollution always caught up. Then came the summer of 1854, when cholera swept through the city and killed 6% of the population in a matter of months. Typhoid fever became so common that Chicagoans just accepted it as a fact of life. If you lived in Chicago, you knew someone who died from drinking the water. Maybe it was your neighbor's kid. Maybe it was your own mother. Death from disease wasn't unusual. It was expected. By the 1880s, the city was facing a crisis point. Dr. John Rausch, the state's public health official, stood before the city council and told them the truth nobody wanted to hear. Gentlemen, we are slowly poisoning ourselves to death. We are drinking our own sewage, and unless we do something radical, this city will not survive another generation. The politicians knew he was right, but what could they do? You can't just pick up a city and move it somewhere else. That's when the engineers started talking about something that sounded like pure fantasy. What if, they said, we could make the river flow the other direction? Instead of flowing into Lake Michigan, what if we made it flow away from the lake, away from our drinking water, away from the city entirely? The idea was simple in concept, but staggering in execution. Dig a canal so large and so deep that it would create a new path for the water, one that would reverse the natural flow of the Chicago River and send all that sewage south, down toward the Illinois River, then to the Mississippi, and eventually all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, you've got to understand, this had never been done before. Rivers don't just flow backwards because you want them to. The Chicago River had been flowing into Lake Michigan since the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago. The idea of reversing it was like saying you were going to make the sun rise in the west. But Chicago was desperate, and desperation makes people do extraordinary things. The man who championed this insane idea was a civil engineer named Ellis Chesbrough. He'd already performed one miracle for Chicago. Back in the 50s, he'd literally raised the entire street level of downtown by 8 to 14 feet using thousands of jack screws, lifting entire buildings while businesses stayed open inside them. If anyone could pull off reversing a river, it was him. But Chesbrough died in 1886 before his dream could be realized. the torch cast to a new generation of engineers, men like Isham Randolph and Lyman Cooley, who would spend the next 14 years bringing this vision to life. The project they designed was called the Sanitary and Ship Canal, and it was going to be the largest earth-moving project in American history up to that point. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. 28 miles long from Chicago to Lockport. In some places, it would be 35 feet deep and 300 feet wide. They were going to move more earth than was moved for the Panama Canal, and they were going to do it with horses, mules, steam shovels, and the backs of thousands of immigrant workers. Construction began in 1992, and it was brutal work. They hired anyone who would take it. Irish immigrants fresh off the boat, Polish workers from the stockyards, Italian laborers, African Americans who'd come north looking for opportunity. These men worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week for $1.50 a day. They worked in mud that came up to their knees, in summer heat that made men collapse, in winter cold that turned the earth hard as iron. The dynamite blasts could be heard across the city. Boom, 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 like a slow heartbeat, the sound of Chicago remaking itself. And people died. Oh, they died. There were no safety regulations back then, no workers' compensation, no OSHA inspectors. Men were crushed under rock slides, blown apart by premature explosions, drowned in mudslides. The official count said 30 workers died during construction, but ask any historian, and they'll tell you the real number was probably closer to 60 or 70. They were mostly immigrants, and their deaths weren't always recorded. They're buried in unmarked graves now, forgotten men who gave their lives so Chicago could have clean water. But the city didn't forget what they were building toward. As the new century approached, there was a growing sense that something momentous was about to happen. The canal was nearly complete. The newspapers were calling it the Chicago Drainage Canal, the eighth wonder of the world. Civic boosters bragged that it would make Chicago unstoppable, would secure the city's place as the greatest metropolis in America. But there was a problem. Not everyone was happy about Chicago's plan. You see, the people downstream, the folks in St. Louis in particular, were absolutely furious. St. Louis got its drinking water from the Mississippi River, and Chicago was about to dump all its sewage into the very water system that fed into the Mississippi. The city of St. Louis filed lawsuits trying to stop the canal from opening. The state of Missouri threatened to mobilize the National Guard. There were genuine fears that this could spark a shooting war between states. The Chicago Sanitary District, which oversaw the project, made a calculated decision. They weren't going to wait for the courts to settle this. They were going to open the canal, and they were going to do it quietly before anyone could stop them. So they picked a date, January 2nd, 1900, right after New Year's Day, when most people would still be recovering from their celebrations, when the newspapers would be running thin staffs, when nobody would be paying attention. The night of January 2nd was cold, bitter, bone-chilling cold, the kind of Chicago winter night where the wind comes off the lake like a knife. A small group of officials and engineers gathered at the controlling works in Lockport, about 30 miles southwest of downtown. There were no speeches, no ribbon cutting, no brass bands, just a handful of men standing in the freezing darkness, their breath making clouds in the air, watching as the workers prepared to open the Bear Trap Dam. Isham Randolph, the chief engineer, gave the order. At 2:15 in the afternoon, though some accounts say it was later, after dark, the workers began opening the sluice gates. The water from the Chicago River began to flow into the canal, tentatively at first, then with increasing force. For weeks, they had been carefully controlling the flow, letting water trickle through to test the system. But on this night, they opened it all the way. And slowly, inexorably, the Chicago River began to reverse. It didn't happen all at once. This wasn't like flipping a light switch. The river had been flowing into Lake Michigan for thousands of years, and it took time for the new path to assert itself. But over the next several days and weeks, the impossible became reality. The Chicago River, which had always flowed east into the lake, now flowed west toward the canal. The water that had been poisoning the city's drinking supply now flowed away, carrying all that sewage and industrial waste south toward the Illinois River and beyond. People in Chicago woke up in the days that followed and slowly realized what had happened. The newspapers, which had been distracted by New Year's coverage, suddenly grasped the magnitude of what the city had done. "River now flows away from the lake," screamed one headline. "Chicago's water supply saved," proclaimed another. There was a sense of triumph, of civic pride that bordered on arrogance. Chicago had literally changed the geography of the continent. They'd taken a problem that killed thousands and solved it through sheer will and engineering prowess. But the celebration was tempered by the reality of what they'd done. St. Louis was outraged, as expected. They filed more lawsuits, and the legal battle would drag on for years. Missouri's governor called it an act of war against the people of our state. Environmental consequences that nobody really thought through started to become apparent. The canal had altered the entire ecosystem of the Great Lakes. It had created a permanent connection between Lake Michigan and the Mississippi River watershed, something that had never existed before. Fish species began migrating in ways they never had. Water levels in the Great Lakes started to drop ever so slightly.